The sun beat down on the endless stretch of desert highway as dust swirled in the truck's wake. A group of armed men followed closely behind, convinced they had an easy target. But the lone trucker wasn't slowing down. He was leading them straight into a trap they wouldn't escape from. Think this trucker was an easy target? Think again. If you love stories of tough men who don't back down, hit that subscribe button now. Don't miss what happens next. The sun hung low over the vast desert, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and crimson. The heat was suffocating, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and dance like a mirage. The long stretch of highway cut through the barren wasteland, empty except for one lone 18-wheeler rumbling steadily along the cracked asphalt. Inside the cab, Jake Slater gripped the wheel with steady hands. A seasoned trucker, he had spent decades on the road, but something about this stretch always put him on edge. Maybe it was the silence, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the stories, drivers who disappeared without a trace, abandoned rigs found with their cargo untouched, but no sign of the driver. Jake wasn't the type to scare easily, but experience had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, they were screaming at him. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The dust cloud in the distance had been trailing him for miles, growing closer. He recognized the telltale signs, several vehicles, moving in unison, always staying just far enough back to avoid suspicion. They weren't just passing through. They were following him. His jaw tightened. Highway bandits, cartel thugs, or maybe just desperate men looking for an easy payday. Whatever the case, Jake knew the rules of the road. Once they got close enough to make a move, there wouldn't be any talking, just violence. Reaching down, he adjusted the knife strapped to his boot, then checked the revolver sitting on the passenger seat. Fully loaded. He had never had to use it before, but tonight, that might change. The convoy behind him was gaining speed. The lead vehicle, a black SUV, dust-covered but unmistakably armored, swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling up beside him. Dark-tinted windows, no plates, the kind of ride meant to intimidate. Jake played dumb, keeping his gaze locked on the road, but his foot eased off the gas. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make them think they had the upper hand. A second SUV cut in behind him, boxing him in. A third appeared ahead, crawling along the shoulder. The trap was closing. Jake exhaled, flexing his fingers against the wheel. They thought they had him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment the SUV ahead of Jake veered onto the highway, slamming its brakes just enough to force him to slow down, he knew they were making their move. The vehicle to his right kept pace, staying close, while the one behind inched forward, boxing him in completely. They weren't leaving him a way out. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened as he caught a glimpse of movement through the side mirror. The back door of the trailing SUV swung open, and two masked men emerged, rifles in hand. They weren't here to negotiate. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker from the lead vehicle. "Pull over, old man! Don't make this harder than it has to be!" Jake smirked. They had no idea. Keeping his right hand steady on the wheel, he reached down with his left, grabbing hold of the lever next to the seat. In one swift motion, he yanked it up, cutting the truck's air brakes just slightly. The 18-wheeler lurched, jerking as if something had gone wrong. He saw the men exchange glances, thinking he was panicking. That was their first mistake. He adjusted his grip, slowing just enough to make them comfortable. One of the gunmen in the SUV behind stepped up onto the running board, trying to climb onto his trailer. Their second mistake. Jake waited until the last possible second, then yanked the wheel hard to the right. The massive rig swerved, its steel frame groaning as it whipped into the black SUV beside it. Tires screamed against the asphalt as the impact sent the smaller vehicle careening off the road, flipping onto its side in a cloud of dust and shattered glass. The men in the trailing SUV shouted in panic as their partner vehicle was taken out. but they didn't have time to regroup. Jake wasn't done. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, the truck roaring forward like an unleashed beast. The sudden speed forced the SUV in front to react, swerving erratically as the driver tried to keep control. One of the masked gunmen raised his rifle, aiming straight at Jake's windshield. Jake reached for the glove box. They thought he was just another trucker, an easy target. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who had spent 20 years in special forces. In one fluid motion, he pulled out the sawed-off shotgun, swung it across the cab, and squeezed the trigger. The blast ripped through the windshield, tearing straight into the side of the SUV ahead. The force of the shot shattered the rear window, sending the gunman tumbling onto the highway. The remaining vehicles panicked, swerving to avoid the wreckage. Jake had turned the tables. Now it was their turn to run. The echo of the shotgun blast still rang through the desert air, mixing with the chaos of screeching tires and panicked shouts. The SUV in front skidded sideways, its driver fighting for control. In the rearview mirror, Jake saw the second vehicle veering off the road, plowing into the dirt. But he wasn't done. He slammed the shifter into a lower gear, letting the massive torque of the truck propel him forward with brutal force. The lead SUV, its back window blown out, its driver barely holding on, was now his next problem. One of the masked gunmen inside twisted around, frantically lifting an assault rifle. Jake could see the whites of his eyes through his balaclava, panic setting in. "That's right, kid. You should have picked an easier target." Jake yanked the wheel just enough to bring his truck's massive front bumper in line with the SUV's rear. Then he hit the gas. The truck rammed into the back of the smaller vehicle, metal grinding against metal as the impact sent it spinning like a toy. The gunman inside lost his grip, his rifle clattering onto the pavement as the SUV careened off the road, flipping 3 times before landing in a heap of crumpled steel. The second SUV, still trailing behind, had seen everything. The driver, who had likely expected an easy job robbing a helpless trucker, now had a decision to make. Fight or flee. Jake didn't give them a choice. He cut the wheel, angling his rig directly toward them, his foot steady on the accelerator. Dust and smoke kicked up behind him as the powerful 18-wheeler bore down on them like a freight train with no brakes. The driver of the last SUV wavered for half a second, then made the only smart choice left. The tires locked up as they whipped the vehicle around, accelerating in the opposite direction. Jake watched them retreat, a trail of dust marking their escape. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders as the tension finally left his muscles. They had followed him into the desert, thinking he was an easy mark. Now they were running for their lives. Jake let out a low chuckle, gripping the wheel. "Wrong truck, boys." Jake watched the last SUV disappear over the ridge, leaving only a trail of dust in the fading desert light. His knuckles loosened on the wheel as the adrenaline slowly bled away, but he knew better than to let his guard down. These guys weren't amateurs. Cartels didn't operate on luck, they worked with intel. That meant someone had tipped them off, but whoever thought he was an easy mark had made a fatal mistake. Jake pulled his truck onto a more secluded stretch of the road, away from the wreckage of the flipped SUV. He grabbed his revolver from the dashboard, checked the cylinder, then reached under his seat. His fingers found the handle of an old, well-worn Bowie knife. Just in case. Stepping out, boots crunching against gravel, he took in the damage. The first SUV was totaled, its frame mangled, windshield shattered. The bodies inside weren't moving. He wasn't interested in making sure they were still breathing. He turned toward the second SUV, the one that had managed to flee. That's when he saw it. A man crawling from the wreckage, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The cartel thug's mask had been ripped off in the crash, revealing a face barely older than a kid, maybe 20, maybe younger. Jake sighed. He should put him down and be done with it. Instead, he crouched beside him. "You got a name, kid?" The young man groaned, trying to push himself up with his good arm. He coughed out something in Spanish, voice hoarse, but Jake caught it. "Mateo," the kid wheezed. Jake studied him, taking in the fear behind those dark eyes. He wasn't just afraid of dying. He was terrified of something else. "Who sent you?" Jake asked, his voice low and steady. Mateo hesitated. Then he shook his head. "They'll kill me." Jake nodded. "Maybe." He pulled out his revolver, spun the chamber. "But I might get to you first." The kid swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his face. His eyes darted toward the horizon, as if expecting backup. And that's when Jake heard it, the distant hum of engines. His jaw clenched. They weren't done. He stood up, looking toward the ridge where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Dust plumes rose from the earth, signaling incoming vehicles. Not just one, but at least 3. Reinforcements. "Damn it," Jake muttered, rolling his shoulders. He turned back to Mateo. "You got 2 choices, kid. You run with them, or you stand with me." Mateo's breathing was ragged, his face pale. But he wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming. A slow nod. "I stand with you." Jake grunted, offering him a hand. "Then let's get ready." They had maybe 5 minutes before the next fight started. This wasn't over yet. The roar of approaching engines sent vibrations through the desert floor, stirring up clouds of dust in the fading twilight. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself, while Mateo, still shaking from the wreck, did his best to stand. "You ever fire one of these before?" Jake asked, tossing a spare pistol toward the kid. Mateo caught it awkwardly, gripping the handle like it was a snake about to bite him. He hesitated before shaking his head. Jake sighed, cracking his neck. "Figures. Just stay low, and if you gotta shoot, aim for the chest." The first truck crested the ridge, headlights slicing through the dusty haze. Then another, and another. They weren't just bringing reinforcements, they were bringing an army. Jake exhaled through his nose. He'd been in worse situations. "Get behind the rig," he muttered to Mateo. "Stay close. You run. I won't be able to cover you." The kid nodded, gripping the pistol with both hands as he ducked behind one of the rear tires. Jake, meanwhile, strode forward, standing tall as the convoy rolled to a stop. A long silence stretched between them. Then the driver's door swung open, and a man stepped out. Taller than Jake. Lean, dressed in tactical black, with a scar running from his left cheek down to his collarbone. "Jake Carter," the man said smoothly, his Spanish accent thick but refined. "I should have known it was you." Jake smirked. "You always send boys to do your dirty work, Hector." Hector Navarro. A cartel enforcer Jake had run into once before, back when he was running security for an oil company down in Texas. That had been years ago, but men like Hector never changed. They just climbed higher up the food chain. "You made quite the mess," Hector continued, nodding toward the wreckage behind Jake. "That was expensive cargo you destroyed." Jake shrugged. "Next time, pick better drivers." Hector chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. More doors opened. More men stepped out. Jake counted 12, armed, organized, ready. "You know how this ends," Hector said, taking slow steps toward him. "Hand over the kid. Walk away. Maybe if I'm feeling generous, I'll let you keep your truck." Jake turned his head slightly. Mateo was still crouched, watching, eyes wide with fear. He was just a kid, too young to be mixed up in cartel business, and Jake knew exactly what would happen if he handed him over. So he made a decision. Jake reached into his jacket and in the blink of an eye drew his revolver. Boom! The shot rang out, echoing across the desert. Hector staggered, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his expensive shirt. His men hesitated, just for a second. That was all Jake needed. He spun, grabbing Mateo by the collar. "Run!" Gunfire erupted behind them as they bolted toward the truck. Bullets slammed into the steel frame, sparks flying, but Jake didn't stop. He shoved Mateo into the passenger seat and climbed in after him, twisting the key in the ignition. The old engine roared to life. Jake gritted his teeth and threw it into gear. "Hold on, kid!" The 18-wheeler lurched forward, tires spitting dirt. The cartel men scrambled, some diving out of the way as the massive rig barreled toward them. Jake barely missed Hector, who was still clutching his wound, shouting orders. Then they were through. The truck roared down the desert road, gunfire still cracking in the distance. Jake kept his foot pressed to the floor, knowing they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the pursuit began. Mateo, breathless, turned to him. "What now?" Jake glanced at him, jaw tight. "Now," he said, "we disappear." The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. And behind them, in the growing dust cloud, Hector Navarro would be planning his next move. Jake knew this wasn't over. Not yet.